I'd like to ask each of you to assess from your own experience the accuracy of this assertion, that the rise of the global public network, the internet, is increasingly driving conflict among three values long associated with our participatory democracy. Those values are free speech, privacy, and security. What has changed in the last 5 years to drive that conflict, and what do we need to do over the next 5 years to keep the three in balance? And remember, as you talk, that the way our mics work, you need to push to turn on your mic and push to turn it off. And I'll see, does anybody want to take that first?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I feel a little bit like this is the question, it's like the season preview of the newsroom when Will McAvoy is asked the question by a university student, is America still the greatest country on earth? And his answer got him into a lot of trouble for fans of the show. I think the problem goes back a lot more than 5 years ago. It's 9/11. And I think the balance of power shifted after 9/11, and national security took on a heightened importance that tipped the balance between the right to gather news, privacy, and national security. So the way I think about it is that is kind of the stepping off point. The Bush administration did a lot of things under the name of national security based on what we've seen from various leaks of classified information. The Obama administration is doing even more, query whether or not national security is just air cover for Project PRISM and some of their activities. And the only kind of statistic that I feel kind of compelled to share with everyone tonight is that never in a presidential administration, especially a Democratic presidential administration, have there ever been so many prosecutions of whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. In fact, if you aggregate all prosecutions in every American presidency in history, they still don't total the number under the Obama administration.
And I'll jump off of that. I think as we look at the values that you laid out, Bill, of free speech, privacy, and security, I would add another one that I think weaves its way across and through and connects those, which is openness. And I think that stands aside from these other values, but is deeply connected to them. And I think that the rise of the internet and new technologies have been an engine for openness, but those same new technologies have also created new threats for openness. And that's where I think a lot of the complications we get to around new kinds of threats on press freedom, new kinds of crackdowns on leaks, and new questions about privacy versus security. And if you haven't seen Jeff Jarvis's very good blog post in The Guardian, their comment is free section this past week on privacy versus secrecy, I really recommend it. I won't quote it here, but he does a very nice job showing that privacy is not the thing that I think is dying, but secrecy is, if openness continues to be on the rise. I think the interesting thing that I see throughout this, with the rise of openness and the rise of new tools and the internet, is the way that media making has repositioned itself again as a central part of democratic engagement. So I think that we've sort of reawoken to or remembered that central role that journalism plays in democracy, and that now we're at a position where more and more people outside of journalism, because I think journalists themselves have recognized that obviously for a long time, and it's been a core value of journalism, but now we have new people engaging in acts of journalism and seeing that as democratic engagement. So I think of things like the Occupy movement, where you had people who had never thought of themselves as journalists before, picking up cameras and live streaming video from protests, or creating websites or taking to blogs to chronicle and bear witness during that movement, to report on that movement. And they didn't sort of engage in the protest, but they actually saw their role of engaging in that democratic movement through media making. I think we also see that in the note that Dick Toffel put on the most recent Snowden story at ProPublica, in which he wrote an extended memo sort of to the public about why they published that piece. And in that was grounded in the act of journalism and the public's right to know. And then I think we also see it in things like the new Dutch leak site that just launched today, which is actually based on WikiLeaks essentially, but backed by the Dutch media organizations as well. And across these things, the thing that connects these things is how new technology and the internet are forcing open things that were not open before. But that creates a lot of tension, obviously, as well, and a lot of questions. I think we'll grapple with a lot of those questions today and later over the next 2 days, I think. But I think what I see is that those citizens who are engaging in new acts of journalism, the journalists who are putting forward their right to publish this work in the face of a government and governments around the world who want to crack down on it, and transparency activists like the Sunlight Foundation and the work that Ken does, together this is the formation of a new sort of openness coalition. And I think what we need to do is to find the ways to connect all these different pieces around openness and to really begin to create what I would call a global movement that really engages the public in this next stage of the fight to protect this.
Thanks. I would echo what the two earlier speakers had said. I thought I was going to be the contrarian here at the panel because when I think about this question, whether or not the global network has changed the dynamic between free speech and privacy and free press and privacy and free speech and security. I mean, I think there's always been a dynamic tension between those things, and there always will be a dynamic tension between the free press and security, the free press and privacy. That's not new. It's always going to be there. And it was there long before there was an internet, long before there was a Snowden, long before we got to where we are now in the media landscape. But what's changed now is that, the media landscape is much different than it was when Donald Graham, the elder Donald Graham, before the Bezos family bought out his family, said that journalism is the first draft of history. When he said that, there was such a thing as a news cycle. There is no such thing as a news cycle these days. There were deadlines. They were neatly compartmentalized. People knew that those of us in the daily print media knew that after the final edition, we had 20-something hours to get it right and get it better. That's changed. But in this new environment, at the same time, journalists really need to care about access to information. They need to care about internet freedom. That's why things that like Craig's organization is doing is extremely important, not just here, but around the world. I mean, I wanted to change the topic of our panel because it's called the First Amendment, Privacy and Security. And the problem is the First Amendment is the borders of this country, but free press and free speech is important and important values in democracies all over the world, not just in the US. But journalists have to care about those things. They have to care about open government. They have to care about access to information. They have to care about internet freedom. And we have to care about the public's right to know and to publish unfettered by government for healthy democracy to survive. Will the tension between privacy and security ever get solved? I don't think so. I mean, I think there will always be a situation where, here's the government's take on this. If an editor found on his desk a pile of information that was stamped classified, as far as the government is concerned, the editor has asked and answered what he needs to ask. He should pick up that stack of papers and hand it back without thinking about what it says or what story it tells. For most editors, responsible editors or news directors in our business, in journalism, that's not the easy way to do it. Now, do we feel that it's our responsibility, our role, or the right thing to do to publish national secrets that will endanger people? No, that's not what we think is the case. But do we think it's our role to make sure that what we're telling our public, our readers, our audience is a version of truth that may be a little different than the sanitized version the government would tell you? Absolutely. And that's not new. It's important, but it's a value that will always be a part of journalism.
My turn. I'll try to give a little bit of an international perspective from the journalists that I work with. The Investigative dashboard is really, it's an online research desk for journalists working in the emerging democracies and developing world. And we have on our database, we have over 450 databases listed on the site that cover over 120 jurisdictions. So on the one hand, we're really benefiting from this openness. The e-government movement and all of the increase in data has given them access to various business registries to do their research, but we're still finding that there's an incredible amount of barriers to access, whether it's, simple things, or not simple, but basic things like language barriers, but also payment schemes. The cost of access of some of these databases is exorbitant. But on another level, there's also been a rollback in many of these countries from their democratic processes. It's the financial crisis has really taken a toll on these countries as well. There's been an increase in unemployment and inequality. And overall, what's happened is there's been a real sort of disillusionment with democratic processes, and that's enabled a lot of these governments to shift to the right. And they've been cracking down on the media significantly in Poland, Hungary, Macedonia, and in Russia. So it's increasingly difficult for them to be able to operate that they have. And they're trying to do a lot of collaboration amongst themselves. Our journalists are finding that they're becoming almost conduits of information, and they're working with their colleagues across borders as their stories and the organized crime figures move from border to border, and then that way they can share in their investigative resources.
But, you talk a little bit about the crackdown in countries that are traditionally viewed as non-democratic countries, more repressive countries, North Korea, places like that. But just to level the playing ground, globally, there are 60 countries where there is active censorship every day. And what is most frightening to me is not what's going on in Russia or North Korea, but what's going on in Singapore or Australia or the UK. In Singapore, 2 weeks ago, the government said that if you have a news blog, you have to pay a $40,000 performance bond. And it's essentially a government license to run a news blog. And you're also required to take down what the Singapore Media Development Authority calls objectionable content, whatever that means, within 24 hours of getting notice from the Singapore Media Development Authority. So it is not traditional enemies of democracy. These, it's not Putin and the Pussy Riots and putting, 3 people in jail for doing things that gets the government's nose out of joint. It is our traditionally democratic friends who are now engaging in censorship.
I would echo that. I just got back from a 10-day trip to Turkey, where they're celebrating the 10th anniversary of their access to information law at the same time that they are writing a new constitution. And among the scholars and the non-government organizations within Turkey, there was a great amount of enthusiasm that as they began to write the new constitution a year ago, it was the first time ever that the government had ever sought citizen input from nonprofit organizations, from citizens groups, from ordinary citizens and the like, about what should go into the new constitution. Well, here's what's happened since. Nobody has seen a draft. The people who are writing the Constitution are doing so behind closed doors. And while they were writing this Constitution, they passed a new statute that said that the government can block any internet site that they choose to block. And so what's happening right now is, at the same time that the people involved in open government, either as an advocate or as a government administrator, are excited about the 10th anniversary of their law and wondering about how they might make it better, but they're also sitting down with a sort of relegated resolve to just accept What the new Constitution is going to say is going to be what the ruling party wants the new Constitution to say. And someday they'll get to see a draft. And that while they would love for, well, the advocates among them would love for one reformist to get the administrative body that oversees open government in Turkey out of the prime minister's office into something that could at least pass for independence, they know that that's not likely to happen.
I had an interesting thing about Ghana. I was there a couple of years ago, and their constitution was written in 1992, and there's actually an entire chapter on media. It's 2 pages long, very fine print, lots of bullet points, and it's all to protect the independence of the media. So when I saw that, I was wondering to myself, will we eventually see issues pertaining to the internet and online security make their way in? And I'm sort of wondering how these these countries that are going through these transitions will actually handle that process. So it's interesting to hear what's going on in Turkey. I guess it's not going as well as it did in Ghana. The Ghanaians are very proud of their constitution and the protection to media freedoms.
It's an interesting lens to look at these issues through, the crafting of a new constitution and some of the crafting of new laws, because I think sometimes, or I worry sometimes, that our First Amendment, being the strong protection that it is, has also allowed us as a nation to take those protections for granted. That we assume that the First Amendment's there so we don't have to worry about it. We assume that government won't do what we saw happen to Glenn Greenwald's partner in the UK and to the Guardian's hard drives. We assume some of these things because we've got the First Amendment. It's there. And I feel like one of the things in talking with my friends and family who don't work in the media space recently has been a creeping sensation around both the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment recently that we actually need to stand up for these things, that we actually have a role in demanding that we transition our understanding of these rights to a digital age. And what does that mean? What does press freedom mean? Is it only an institutional protection or is it an individual right? What does privacy mean in the age of the NSA? And so I'm hopeful that that discussion is happening, and I actually think that in many ways it's overdue.
I'd like to carry on the privacy thread for a minute and ask another question, and I hope after this that folks in the audience will pull some. Actually, this thing. Well, yeah, I'll use this. So I want to stick with the privacy thread for a minute and just ask you to think about this for a minute. I remember, a few years ago. And then more recently, a few years ago, Eric Schmidt said, and then more recently, I think Mark Zuckerberg said, words to the effect of, get over it, there's no such thing as privacy anymore, forget about it. And I think that the disclosures about the NSA and PRISM of the last few months may suggest why they had good reason to say that, or maybe they knew things that we didn't all know that we now know about privacy. But interestingly, I now find myself pausing at my keyboard before I write a thought that you might think of as being political, wondering how it might fit into a collection of years of my writing viewed by some anonymous NSA analyst. We all remember the song by British pop star Sting, who wrote in the lyrics, every move you make, every step you take, every word you say, every single day, I'll be watching you. In such a world, does this power to intimidate or chill speech before it is uttered, is that the world that we're moving into now? And how is that going to affect journalists? And how do we balance that against the state's need to know about bad actors? Craig, you and I were having a conversation earlier about this subject, and I'd be curious to get you to respond first.
Sure. I think that especially, I think you're absolutely right when you talk about First Amendment rights versus Fourth Amendment rights. But, over the past 12 months, we've seen 3 huge prosecutions against, folks who have leaked classified information to the press. We've seen warrantless surveillance of the Associated Press over a period of 2 months, where the Justice Department monitored 20 phone lines at the Associated Press in violation of their own guidelines. You've got a Fox News reporter who has been under surveillance. And probably most scary of all, there is a new decision out of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the circuit in Virginia where all the intelligence agencies live, holding that there's no shield law, no federal shield law for journalists. So to the extent you are getting classified information or national security information, you don't have the right to withhold the name of your source. Or so says the Fourth Circuit. And I think the question that raises in my mind is, what does that mean for journalism? Day-to-day reporters, what does that mean? I can tell you from a case I was telling Bill about earlier that I'm involved in or was involved in, there was a reporter that was onto a terrific story, absolute spectacular story. Was it Peabody or Pulitzer material? Maybe. But the media organization was petrified of a libel lawsuit. So after a few well-placed calls to the publisher and some threats that, Westmoreland cost CBS News $25 million to litigate, you want to litigate with us, you're going to litigate with us if you publish this story. Story was never told, and it was a very, very important story. So I think the question is, to what extent are these events, the AP phone hacking, surveillance of reporters, and now this movement where you had the Obama administration, right after they were taking a lot of heavy fire over the AP hacking, they introduced legislation for a federal shield law. But what they don't tell you is that there are exceptions for national security. And it also raises more difficult issues of who is a journalist. Is WikiLeaks, are they the New York Times? So I think short answer to your question is, it scares me as someone who loves journalism and thinks that there is no higher calling, that these developments are petrifying.
I agree, and I also think, we've talked here, you mentioned the Fox News reporter Rosen and James Risen from the New York Times, and I get worried about also, bloggers like Marcy Wheeler, who is an independent blogger on her own, running a donation campaign right now so that she can keep doing her work. Or people who we funded at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, like Kevin Gastolza, who basically covered the Manning trial, gavel to gavel. And I worry about those folks as well, who, as these threats increase and as these decisions are made, like the Fourth Circuit one, these are folks who don't have a legal team behind them to fight these fights. These are folks in the new nonprofit sector who are running these small local investigative journalism nonprofits that are cropping up around the country, for whom they don't have a fund that they can go to if they get a frivolous lawsuit from a real estate developer or a government agency. And for that reason, we need the shield law for some of those people. We need anti-SLAPP legislation, which would stop frivolous lawsuits that are meant to stop public participation. We need a whole range of new sorts of protections for a new range of kinds of journalists who are out there committing acts of journalism. And for every concern and worry that I have about the New York Times reporter, I have tenfold for these other reporters as well.
And I would add to the list of those protections, we need a stronger whistleblower protections. One of the untold stories regarding Mr. Snowden and the revelations regarding NSA and PRISM and the like is that for people in the security agencies, there really are no whistleblower protections at all. If there is a statutory need within the federal government, that is one thing. The shield law is extremely important for those of us who practice journalism, but I personally am not comfortable with any definition that's ever been written on a shield law that defines what a journalist is, and that includes the shield law we passed in Washington State when Governor Gregoire handed me the second pen after she signed it, but it contained a definition on journalists, and I'm not comfortable with that. I sort of feel that, we would be better off if all of the state shield laws and the federal shield law was written, and we left the wisdom of who is a journalist to the wisdom of the courts, rather than a lawmaker trying to write that into statute.
Let me put you on the spot just a little bit. When is the last time, you have seen a significant libel case or a significant defamation case against a media organization in the last decade?
I can't think of one that comes to mind, though. I'm sure.
Okay, and what does that mean for journalism? Does that mean that the watchdog has been put on a leash, and because of financial concerns, that reporting is less than zealous?
It could mean that. It could mean the type of reporting that might end up in a defamation action isn't happening as frequently as it used to. Or it might mean the story that you just told a second ago about that tremendous story that you didn't describe in detail, but one that you thought was certainly a significant story that never got told because somebody backed down, is happening more often than we would like to think.
Ken, I want to jump on what you said about the shield law, because you're not alone in your commitment to avoiding sort of a definition of journalist coming out of Congress. I don't know how many of you followed this, but the Society for Professional Journalists just a week or two ago passed a resolution that rejected any definition of journalist coming out of Congress that amounted to anything other than a person who commits acts of journalism. And we've seen that echoed by AEJMC and others. And so we're seeing a consensus growing, but at the same time, we're seeing people on the Hill, especially Senators Feinstein and Durbin, pushing for even more restrictive definitions of who's a journalist. Right now, the Senate bill only protects people who regularly practice journalism, and the House bill only protects people who practice journalism for financial gain. So that, and on top of the national security loopholes that this includes, our shield law that's moving through Congress that has the support of the White House is fundamentally flawed right now. And I want to take this opportunity to tell you, in a week from now, we're getting ready to launch a major campaign at Free Press to try to fix this bill, to bring our 600,000 members to bear on this political process. And hopefully, before this bill gets through, we can strip out some of these bad definitions, fix some of the loopholes, and it's going to be a fight. But the opportunity that exists here is to avoid a really slippery slope where this bill, which is an additional protection for the press, but could set up a cascading effect if we have a bill that has a really bad definition of journalist in it. And it doesn't have to be this way, because the House version of this bill, one, doesn't have the national security loopholes, but two, also has a relatively decent definition of journalism that avoids, I think, a lot of the traps that we worry about. So the House definition says, the gathering, preparing, collecting, photographing, recording, writing, editing, reporting, or publishing of news or information that concerns local, national, and international events or matters of public interest for dissemination to the public. Perhaps more specific than I feel like it needs to be. But if that's what makes lawmakers comfortable, I think that definition of journalism could stand in the bill without the covered persons clauses, which begin eliminating other people who are eligible.
And not to be mealy-mouthed on that topic, but I agree with everything that Josh said. I like that definition a lot better than the one that Feinstein initially wrote in the bill. However, I do think a federal shield law is important. I mean, journalists should not go around thinking that we've got a constitutional protection to protect sources right now. That does not exist. It went away a long time ago.
Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'd like to just follow up on a question to the panel. I'm troubled a little bit by the efforts to try to put what's going on in the media landscape into some sort of a legal and constitutional framework, because I think what I'm sensing is that it's much more of a Wild West, much more of sort of pirates, if you will, who have a camera, are someplace, and they've got a compelling photo, and up it goes. And so, meanwhile, while the legal eagles are back dividing up the cheese into smaller little legislative pieces, the cat's out of the bag. I mean, the story, and this is particularly, I think, true in these nations where there are fragile democracies anyway. The technology has made it seemed to me almost impossible to legislate and to after the fact go after people. So I guess what I'm wondering is, if that's what we've got, is there something about a way of thinking about what is ethical and right that isn't necessarily based in legislation and the Constitution from 200 years ago? Because I mean, and I guess I'm thinking of, everything from the court of public opinion to say, well, yeah, it was illegal as hell, but man, I'm really glad that came out. Or, no, I know it was legal what they did, but we've held that person up to ridicule and we shouldn't have done it. I mean, there's just different sort of whole atmospherics about what the public and a society would view as being appropriate. And I just think that the technology is so far ahead of where the law is, that we're kind of a dangerous area. Because just as you say, there's a great openness. The thing is, when people are burned, or when people feel that sense of their privacy, and Tennessee, give an example, permits to carry guns had been open records until somebody put them online, and now they're closed. And so and there's a million examples everywhere about that, whether it's the NCAA saying you can't come on my campus, or the NFL saying, no, we're not letting you have that image, or the NBA, we're going to sue your ass if you run a picture of a player that you took. So I guess I'm kind of wondering if we don't need something that's larger or more appropriate to the times and the technology than what you've been talking about.
You make a good point, Chris. I mean, indeed, the technology is part of that dynamic tension we talked about between the First Amendment, privacy, security. Technology is there too. And, I don't think you have to go to a third world country to come up with a great example. One of my favorite examples has to do with good new-fashioned dashboard cameras on police cars. I mean, 10 states have passed laws that said, if you catch a policeman abusing someone on camera, you just interfered with him in the performance of his duty. The most ridiculous thing you could think of. Now, I don't think the public will let that fly. And so far, the courts haven't let that fly where it's been tested. But there have been legislators, I don't know how that happened in several legislators, who have passed laws that said it's illegal to film a cop, even if he's beating up somebody who's doing nothing. And so the technology is there it's happening faster than journalists can figure out what to do with it.
Well, yeah, and that's a really great example. So then, what do you say then to the public about that? No, this is stupid. You're not interfering with you're actually being a watchdog. But that's where I think that I think that part of what we've talked about here is going to bog down, because I just think we need to, and I think it'd be, and some of you who are dealing with this in sort of the public realm need to help the public, and then the journalists, define very broadly, think somehow more expansively and holistically about what's ethical. Because if you did what you just described and you caught Rodney King getting beaten up, that was a good thing for this country. That needed to come out. But if you're in a third world nation where you have examples of corruption or greed or brutality, or if you're in Syria right now, wouldn't we, think about how important it is to have what I'm sure were clearly illegal examples of people taking pictures of folks who were gassed. So we have to think about it in ways that I think would resonate more with the public, and I'm not sure, to be honest, that the constitutional framework with a lot of people is working right now because of the fears over security and privacy. And I think actually that's what you're seeing in the erosion of the First and Fourth Amendments. I think the public's pretty ambivalent about some of that.
I think the public will understand. The very first precept of the SPJ Code of Ethics is seek truth and tell it, or something very close to that. And I think the public understands that. that same public, though, is among those who are leery about invasions of privacy. So that same camera that caught the cop beating up Rodney King scares the hell out of people that it's going to catch them going to their girlfriend's house. So keep that in mind.
I think what I hear Chris saying, and I really agree, is that, and this really concerns me, there's no line of sight for the public to a shield law or a whistleblower prosecution or a publishing tax and their personal experience and whether this affects them at all. And I'm also concerned the degree to which journalism has contributed to that, because I'm not so sure even if there was line of sight, they would rally to our cause, or to, which should be their cause. I think that's what we all agree on. But I think there's so much distrust. You know, I mean, the irony is there's a distrust in government, but there's somehow this trust that they're doing the right thing with all this information they're collecting, or at least it's a necessary evil. And John and I were talking about this issue of trust. So Ken, I have to take a little bit of issue. I don't think there is this imperative of privacy with this. Certainly the generation now, of millennials, whatever you want to call them. I think that the issue of trust and privacy are very different things to that generation than they might be to mine, because I have a line of sight. I remember when, and I don't think they have had that kind of experience yet. So my question would be, how could we create that line of sight? And also, just what has the panel discovered around how that the younger generation views trust? Who do they trust? Why do they trust? How would you build trust with them? Because that trust seems to be some part of the currency that would help us build that line of sight.
Well, I think in many ways the question you're asking, I mean, look, many people in this room are children of Watergate. They remember the Pentagon Papers, and when the press had a totally different role, and the public recognized the fact that what journalists did back then was really, really important, because they wouldn't have known about any of this. And I think the question you're raising is, given the concerns about national security, and people, they don't care that Google is scanning your email for keywords. They don't care that the Postal Service is photographing every envelope that goes through its system. They're more worried about safety. And the question is, I mean, how do you break through that logjam? How does the 20-something generation think about that issue? They didn't hear about Daniel Ellsberg. They didn't watch kind of these epic fights between the New York Times and the Justice Department. And how is this generation, I mean, they get their news from Twitter and Facebook. Do they have an appreciation for what journalism is?
Interestingly, as someone, I spend my days doing community organizing and trying to educate the public around a lot of these issues. And young people specifically. I've been running our internship and fellowship program for almost 5 years now. And the day that the NSA stories broke, one of our interns wrote a blog post saying, people of my generation always knew we were being watched. It was either Target or Google or Facebook or the government. No surprise there. But that doesn't make it any less wrong, and that doesn't make me any less angry. In terms of the way into the line of sight, this is something I've been thinking a lot about. And I think we start with people who are thinking about themselves as media makers and media sharers. And I say that in that they're getting their news from Twitter and Facebook, but they're also sharing their news via Twitter and Facebook. They're saying, this is something I think you should read, my friends. They've become part of the distribution process of media. Or they've become part of the media makers, whether it's a Tumblr blog or a WordPress site or an Instagram feed. They're making media in different ways. And so all of a sudden, when you say, Instagram's changing its terms of service, and it could, it could own the rights to your photos now. That becomes the reason that National Geographic is just about to pull their site off of Instagram. But it's also the reason, my cousin decides that he wants to. So all of a sudden we have these connections, and we meet people where they are. We meet people in the act of media making and in the act of media sharing, and we begin there to begin doing deep and a different kind of media literacy that's really much more of a digital literacy and digital engagement literacy. And I would love to see this kind of digital literacy replace college freshman comp 101. I say that as someone who taught freshman comp 101. I would love to see a kind of digital literacy at the base level of colleges and universities that is essentially journalistic ethics and skills and digital literacy for all students going through college, because they are all given the opportunity now to make media and contribute to the news ecosystem. I think that there's some great resources out there to that end. Books like Dan Gilmour's new book, Media Active, actually has chapters on trustworthy media creation for citizen journalists and for anybody who's sort of going to engage in media, even if you're just going to retweet. What are things you should think about before you retweet that tweet? Is it verified? Is it just rumor? What that sort of thing. So there's some great things out there. The problem is they're locked away, even in Dan's open source book that's free to download. It's still locked away in a book. We need to operationalize it. So what I really hope to do is to begin thinking about how I can go out with our team of members and activists with Free Press and actually begin having these conversations with people who run photography clubs locally or who have blogging networks, and get out in front of people who are at this interesting intersection between media making and thinking about their role in this larger news ecosystem, and begin to make common cause with them between journalist rights, press freedom rights, individual rights around media making, and begin to develop the sort of ethics that you were talking about. And I think, thankfully, we have things like Dan's book, which is a really good on-the-ground primer for anybody, citizen journalist, anyone. But we also have Pointer just released their new ethics handbook, and I haven't seen the whole book yet, but I've seen Kelly McBride, who ran that whole process, speak actually at another event that Bill put together, and I'm very encouraged by the way that Kelly and Pointer has approached their new digital ethics. And I know that SPJ is also launching a new review of their ethics guidelines, and those are the conversations we need to have. I think we would be remiss if we had those behind closed doors and if we didn't involve the public in those discussions.
I wonder if the panelists would address, I mean, somebody asked earlier if, there's a generational divide with regard to an expectation to privacy. Should that be part of the media ethics conversation? And how does that fit in? And how do we get that mindset of a different generation like my son who, writes stuff on Facebook that I, once a year get my wife to call him and say, have him take that down,
The only thing I would say, that I don't want to speak for the younger generation or anything like that. The only thing I would say is that I don't think it draws as cleanly down generational lines as we might expect. I've talked with people like my mom, who posted pictures of my son naked on Facebook, and I said, "Oh, Mom, where are the expectations of privacy there for parents for my son who's not, who's 1.5?" But then we also have issues like stop and frisk in New York City and other cities, where that's a whole other set of privacy issues and privacy that young black men are struggling with every day because they do have an expectation of privacy, and that's being eroded every time they get stopped by police for no reason except for the fact that they were on the street. And so I think when we talk about expectations of privacy and generational issues, I think it is really complex.
Craig, I was intrigued by where you were going with one of your responses, which is whether or not journalists are being aggressive enough, asking the right questions. So while the revelations about the NSA are appalling and shocking on their face, my first question was, where was journalism in uncovering this story anyway? We know that there have been a number of suspected terrorist events in the United States arrested over the last 10 years. And when you follow some of the stories, it always surprised me that it was attributed either to people who had infiltrated terrorist groups, or it always seemed to me odd that there were so many low-level people suddenly being arrested for things that, were these really terroristic threats or not. And I wonder whether, if you put together some of the dots, we've just been missing the biggest story, which is the only way to get some of this information, is that people's communications were being read and watched and followed. What do you think the status of journalism is in a national security age? Are we asking enough questions of Mark Zuckerberg? He has people signed up on his site larger than the population of the United States, second only to India in size. He is collecting data, patterns of usage, tracking of photos and keywords and searches. What do we know about a Mark Zuckerberg, and what does that matter in an age of journalism where all of us are completely dependent on the use of the internet?
You ever saw the 60 Minutes interview with Mark Zuckerberg? Leslie Stahl did what I thought was a brilliant interview, and Zuckerberg was also questioned by Kara Swisher at an All Things Digital event about Facebook and about privacy. And look, I have a son in college, a daughter who just graduated from college, and their sense of the role of journalism in a democracy, as well as privacy, is so different from the way I think about it. And I think different than a lot of us think about it. And the question is, why? I mean, did we do something wrong? I mean, the internet has done so many spectacular things. It is the digital town square, and it has created more opportunities and more access for so many people. And a lot of the work my foundation does, all of our work is outside of the United States. And especially you'll see news that we're able to bring into countries through mesh networks. And these people would never have access to news or information but for some of these technology initiatives. But back to your original question, it's a little rhetorical because, obviously journalists can do a lot better, but we also have to look at the reality of it. And I was having lunch with a former professor here today, and she was asking me about some of the acquisitions of newspaper groups, and who's going to buy the LA Times, who's going to buy the Chicago Tribune. And I said, give me the business case. How are media organizations, especially traditional media organizations, going to make money? Because in order to have aggressive, hard-hitting journalism, you need to have a big war chest. And people like Ken are doing great things, but his war chest is limited. He cannot hire, the best and the brightest to go defend a reporter from, a small newspaper in Iowa who is breaking a great story. He can pick up some of the litigation costs, but he doesn't have the money for it. And the question is, where's it going to come from?
I'd like to ask a question about defining journalists from the standpoint of shield laws. Do you think there's any way to define a journalist that would exclude anyone in the country? Or is it simply a question of what the person does, that anyone could be a journalist from the standpoint of a shield law if they're revealing important information and want to protect their source?
I mean, I think there's two levels here. There's the level of sort of reality of what it takes to do journalism that involves working with a leak, which is what we'd be getting into when it comes to shield law. And then there's the sort of philosophical, like, could anybody do that? I think the reality is that there's only certain people in certain positions within journalism who a leaker would go to and who would be put in a position where they would need to protect a leak. That said, I think in the philosophical sense, I think anybody could be put in that situation. And the example that I like to use is there's this amazing guy in New Jersey who runs a news organization called Hurricane Sandy News, I believe it is. And he runs this entire site on Facebook. So he writes pretty long articles via his Facebook wall, and I think at last time I checked, he had more people following this Facebook page than the New York Times or ProPublica combined on their Facebook pages. He's doing real reporting, interviews, I mean, you name it. He's become a reputable source. All the journalists around New Jersey have much respect for him. I was at a forum recently with him. He's, by all accounts, a citizen journalist. He's working on somebody else's private platform, Facebook. He can't make any money on this because Facebook takes all ad revenue that they place against his content. But he could very easily be given a leaked document or something else from, the FEMA about the recovery efforts that happen in New Jersey. And if he reported on that, would we want him protected? I think we would. And so, in that case, I think, yes, I do think that anyone could be in that position. I think what I hope is that this is part of the larger discussion about how people can act. One of the reasons that I like to use him as an example because he has acted with ethics and with a real journalist sense about things. And so I think that he would report that story fairly and handle his source in a way that we would want him to.
Yeah, that is a point that a lot of people have made in looking at Snowden versus Daniel Ellsberg. And they've said, look, it was the New York Times, it wasn't WikiLeaks. It was this Harvard PhD, not a consultant who worked as a subcontractor to the United States government. Ellsberg didn't flee. Snowden did. Ellsberg, in fact, did go into hiding for 2 weeks after the Pentagon Papers were published and before the Justice Department botched its prosecution of him. So there are all these moral issues about, do you want shield laws to cover everyone who disseminates news and information? Do you want it to cover WikiLeaks? Because, we do want it to cover the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Columbia Missourian and every responsible, ethical news organization. But are we the ones to make that judgment? Or should they just cover any enterprise, any individual who disseminates news or information?
Well, let me push back a little bit at one thing that Josh said. The person who does the Sandy reporting, you could say, he's got a site, he writes a lot of stuff, he has a body of work. You can make what Craig was suggesting, some ethical judgments about the kind of work he does. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm a private citizen and my brother works at the NSA. He doesn't. But, and he tells me, hey, they're monitoring this. And I tweet it. First time in my life I've tweeted. There's no body of work. There's no way to assess my ethics. It's just that I got a great source who told me a great thing. Should I be covered?
Well, if you were to use the sorts of balancing tests that have been established in state shield laws, many state shield laws, it would say, is this information of public import, and were you disseminating it out to the public for the public good? I think would be the balancing test that would be held up against it. How that balancing test would be applied to someone basically tweeting out a document or something along those lines. The one thing I would say is that I think in many cases, and again, this is sort of conjecture, that if you were just tweeting out the document, I don't think that would be reporting. If you had a blog and you did reportage around it, I think that would be a different case. But I honestly haven't thought too much about that scenario.
I think it's a difficult and sticky question, whether or not if somebody tweeting for the first time and publishing for the first time can be called a journalist. But I still like a definition that would be based on the act of journalism as opposed to someone trying to prescribe that they have to be paid or they have to work for a established outlet or something of the sort. One of the people that our small litigation fund did support was a young woman in Seattle, Washington, who lives in a public housing complex and writes regularly on her blog that she maintains herself on housing issues and the like. And, she has not been sued for defamation, but, what she does in terms of writing about public housing issues in the state of Washington is absolutely valuable. And when the Seattle Times wrote an editorial about the litigation case that we supported her in, it was the first time they had written about this issue in which the housing agency in suburban Seattle, Washington, decided to set up a shadow agency with the same board of directors, the same address, the same officers as the official housing agency, except they saw themselves as exempt from the open records law because they the housing agency. They were some other nonprofit group and the like. That would not have come to light but for this young woman who maintains a blog from her wheelchair. And, you know, for me, I think she qualifies as a journalist and is at least as worthy of the protections of a shield law, or of a shield law if there was one, as anyone else. So.
And in the case of the Seattle Times editorial, it pointed out that there was a time not that long ago when 3 full-time reporters would have been covering the agency that she was writing about. Today, there's 1 in the community. So in some ways, we're recognizing the need to replace the traditional journalistic resource, which in the case of the Seattle area, lost 60% of its newspaper newsroom employees over a 4 or 5 year period, which is, 60% is a pretty big number. But it seems to me that you're also getting to the whole question of the First Amendment and what is the press. And if we think that is the frame, I think we want to encourage as many voices trying to contribute to the public discourse as we can have.
Just so, but the question you're asking is a very important one, and in all 40 of the state legislatures where there is a shield law now, or at least states where there is a shield law now, they've had to wrestle with that question. It hasn't been easy anywhere.
I have a question. I would love to know whether you think, the panel, whether you think of Snowden in any sense as a journalist, because I don't. I mean, he had no established credentials as a journalist. He just did a complete dump of data, and he did damage. He did damage to, to our agencies and to our processes. That the Chinese government learned when he went through their airport. You don't think that he could get through their airport without them taking and copying every little bit of information, that he had, and the same is true of the Russians. So, I don't think he fits the definition of a journalist. So I mean, there's nothing. You can't, I realize, I think I saw that Ellsberg came out in his defense, but I really don't feel that, and I remember Ellsberg, one of the reasons I got into journalism, but I don't think it's the same thing. I just don't.
I think the bigger question you're asking is there is a right to a free press, but with that right, is there also a corresponding responsibility? And, you can look at Snowden and you can look at the kind of incredible efforts both the New York Times and the Washington Post went through before they published the Pentagon Papers.
That's right.
They made sure that they weren't jeopardizing national security. They made sure they weren't jeopardizing field agents or anyone's life. So I think this is a hugely complex and nuanced issue, because can you expect a news organization that is not as prominent as those two to consider the broader societal issue of the Constitution doesn't tell me I have to do this, but as a responsible journalist, I'm going to do this, because that's what journalism ethics is about, and that's how you practice great journalism.
Hawley, I'd be really interested in just how some of these issues play out on the international stage that you work on, and whether, what we've been talking about here, how that resonates with your experience.
Well, it certainly does, because many of these countries do not have the democratic traditions that we do, nor do they have the rule of law. So in many of them, they are regularly facing problems with slander and libel abuses. There's still criminal offenses there. And when they start to get into these sorts of troubles, there's nowhere for them to go. Now, clearly, some of these countries like Macedonia, who's in the EU accession process, and then you have Poland and Hungary. They can sort of look to the EU for some guidance, and the EU does have some shield laws, and they can be fairly robust. But even in those countries, they're starting to get rolled back, and the pressure the EU is putting on them has not really had a great effect. So then people, and these journalists in these countries are looking to us, and if we're having trouble figuring it out, then we're really in trouble. So, I absolutely agree that, it's incredibly disturbing to see what's going on here and how urgent these questions are for us all to answer, not only for ourselves, but for everybody else. And I think collectively, we're going to have to find solutions.
What I'd like to see is we've spent the evening talking about a litany of challenges. We've identified dozens of them. And I'm hoping that tomorrow when we break out into our sessions, on this session, we start to do what Chris brought up. How do we build a framework to go forward? To put a point on that, we've talked about the First, Fourth Amendment. How is the conversation being framed? I would contrast that with the Second Amendment. If you're Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, if you own a gun, there's a high probability you're a member of the NRA. The Obama administration tried to frame a conversation about gun control, and the NRA is framing that conversation. When we talk about the First Amendment, we talk about FOI, or we talk about shield laws, that framing is being done by state legislatures and the federal legislature, not by journalism. Journalists are print, broadcast, digital, citizen, and there's a diversity of journalists that do not play together. And it's like herding cats. How do we build a framework that moves us forward that addresses all these issues that we've talked about tonight? How do we stop talking about the problem and start talking about the solution? And I'm hoping all of you will attend this particular version tomorrow in our breakouts on that issue.
I'm going to exercise the facilitator's prerogative to ask one other question that I had on my list, which is a little bit of a subject change, but I hope it's perceived as important. I always remember a comment that is attributed to A.J. Liebling, in which he said, freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. And I'm wondering if we're moving to a world where the only presses which really reach a mass audience are the pipes owned by the likes of Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, and Time Warner. And if that's the case, what should free press advocates be doing today to ensure the independence of those presses from government control?
It's a good day to ask that question because the DC Circuit Court today just started their oral arguments in a case of Verizon versus the Federal Communications Commission, which will actually have huge implications over whether the FCC, our agency that is supposed to oversee communications, has any regulatory authority to do that anymore.
That's the way these companies started, and in large part, that's the way they're operated today. It hasn't been so bad, though. I mean, the Sulzberger family, they control the Times. You know, we'll see what Jeff Bezos does with the Washington Post and whether he's a savior. You also have a lot of very responsible business people stepping in. Look at what's going on right now at the Orange County Register. You have an entrepreneur just putting in piles and piles of money behind print journalism. So is ownership an issue? Of course it is. But I don't think the picture is as bleak as a lot of people think, because there are a lot of responsible people. We'll see what John Henry does with the Boston Globe. But if you look at history, it's worked out pretty well.
I think ownership is less of an issue today than it was 30, 40 years ago when, as Craig points out, anybody with the name publisher in his title probably had an uncle or a grandfather or a dad who owned 20 trucks and 5 presses. They were very wealthy families who controlled publishing, and many of them used it for their own sacred cows. The potential of the global public network is that there could be a great democratization of publishing. I mean, these days, anyone who can create a URL and content to put on it can not only be a publisher, but a publisher with global reach. And there's great potential there. And it's, you know, it's not, I mean, yes, as journalists in the world's best journalism school, we have to care about the quality of what gets published on that platform. But at the same time, the fact that you don't have to be a rich person from a rich family to even be in the publishing business is a good thing and a move in the right direction. So, you know, the question you asked, Bill, is an important one, but I see that the main thing is that journalists need to care about internet freedom. They need to care about it not just within the U.S., but globally, all over the world. And with that, we've got the potential to take this thing in the right direction for good.
Well, once you get outside the U.S. and you start looking throughout Eastern Europe and a lot of the developing world, there are enormous ties between government, media, and political parties. Most politicians feel it's their right to have big business and they have to have a media organization. And it's been incredibly difficult over the last decade or so with the reforms that have been going through in these transition process to break that back. And so the global public network is absolutely vital to these journalists getting their word out and to rolling back the corruption and to rolling back the authoritarian regimes. But now we're seeing that a lot of these governments are finding ways to get control over the internet. And if you read Jared Cohen and Eric Schmidt's book, they foresee a potential network of internets where, you know, individual countries will be able to filter their own networks. And then we'll start to see fault lines along those political divides. And that's a really frightening sort of perspective. And so I think we have to find ways to move beyond that. These are truly global issues. And I know that we're able to have these discussions and we're lucky, but a lot of people cannot have these sort of discussions and they don't have the rule of law to be able to fight these battles.
Thanks for coming, everybody, and appreciate the conversation.